she gave me 48 hours to get out of my own house. Not a warning. Not a notice. A full-blown eviction order taped to my front door while I was inside. Like I didn't even exist. And when I stepped outside, I saw her, standing there in a pressed blazer, sunglasses on, directing a tow truck like she owned the entire neighborhood. My truck hooked. My gate cut open. My land marked with bright orange spray paint like it had already been sold. "You've overstayed," she said, smiling like this was routine. That's when I noticed the boundary stakes. They weren't just wrong, they were off by almost 40 feet. What she didn't know was, I wasn't some random homeowner she could bully. I had just finished a full title search on this land, and buried in 80-year-old records was something that would collapse her entire HOA overnight. I didn't say a word. I just pulled out my phone and hit record. Because what happened next destroyed everything she thought she controlled. CUD. I've dealt with an HOA abusing power. Stay with me. This one ends differently. I'm not the kind of person who panics when someone tapes an eviction notice to my door. I've spent most of my life in places where pressure wasn't optional. It was constant. 8 years military, 2 overseas deployments, and after that, I worked private contracts, infrastructure, land assessments, logistics. The kind of work where mistakes don't just cost money, they cost people. But before all of that, I grew up on land. Real land. The kind you don't measure in square footage, you measure it in memories. Fence posts my grandfather set by hand. Boundary lines he didn't just mark, he memorized. I learned early how to read terrain, how to spot bad survey work, how to tell when someone was guessing instead of knowing. And that land, it's mine now. Passed down, clean and documented, long before this area had paved roads or streetlights. Back when this was still open ground, not the edge of some cookie-cutter subdivision pretending to be a community. That's what it is now. An HOA showed up a few years back, fast build, fast sales, fast rules. The kind of place where every mailbox matches, every lawn is trimmed to regulation height, and every neighbor thinks they've got a say in something they've never earned. I stayed out of it. Didn't sign. Didn't join. Didn't care. Because legally, they had no authority over my property. At least, that's what I thought. The moment they tried to evict me, I already knew something didn't add up. The paperwork felt off. The boundaries didn't line up. And the confidence the way they acted like this was already decided that wasn't normal. That was rehearsed. And I've seen that before. That's what people do when they're not just wrong. They're hiding something. I didn't know it yet, but they weren't just overstepping. They were covering something up. My grandfather bought this land in 1959. Not from a developer. Not through some polished real estate office with brochures and closing gifts. He bought it from a man who shook his hand, walked the perimeter with him, and pointed out the corners using nothing but landmarks and memory. From that oak tree to the creek bend, then straight to the old fence line. That was the map. And back then, that was enough. But my grandfather wasn't careless. A year later, he had it formally surveyed the old school way. Steel chains, transit levels, hand-drawn notes. No satellites, no GPS. Just precision, patience, and a man who understood that land wasn't just dirt, it was legacy. I've seen those records. Not copies originals. Folded, yellowed plats with pencil markings and handwritten measurements. Survey pins logged with exact distances. Bearings written in ink that's older than most of the houses sitting around here now. And every one of those documents ended up in the county archives. Filed. Recorded. Protected. That's the thing about real ownership, it leaves a trail. Growing up, I didn't care about any of that. To me, this place was just home. It was early mornings with cold air and wet grass under my feet. It was my grandfather showing me how to find a boundary marker buried under years of soil like it was buried treasure. He'd tap it with his boot and say, "This right here? This is what keeps everything honest." I didn't understand it then. But I do now, because those markers, those lines, they weren't just legal definitions. They were promises. Promises that no matter what changed around us, this piece of land, this exact stretch of earth would always belong to us. After he passed, everything transferred clean. No disputes, no confusion. Just paperwork that matched perfectly with what had already been there for decades. I made sure of that. Verified every document, cross-checked every record, pulled everything straight from the county database myself. Clear title, undisputed boundaries. Or at least, that's what I believed. Because what I didn't realize was, while our land stayed the same, everything around it was starting to change. It started slow. At first, it was just noise in the distance. Machinery, trucks, the kind of background disruption you ignore because it's not your problem yet. Then the trees started disappearing. Whole sections of land cleared out in weeks areas I used to walk through as a kid, gone, flattened, measured, replaced with bright survey flags and temporary stakes that looked nothing like the ones my grandfather trusted. That's when the signs went up. Future development. Luxury living coming soon. And just like that, the land around me stopped being land. It became a project. Within a year, roads were paved where dirt paths used to be. Streetlights went up. Identical houses started lining up in rows so perfectly spaced it didn't even look real. And right in the middle of it all, the HOA. They didn't ease into it. They came in structured, organized, and aggressive from day one. Rules printed before half the houses were even finished. Committees formed before people had fully moved in. Lawn height regulations. Exterior color approvals. Parking restrictions. Everything controlled. Everything documented. Everything enforced. And the people moving in? They bought into it completely. To them, this wasn't control, it was order. A clean, managed environment where nothing unexpected could happen. But I wasn't part of that system. Never signed anything. Never agreed to their bylaws. Never gave them authority over my property. Because my land? It existed long before their HOA did. And legally that matters. At least it's supposed to. At first they ignored me. I was just the outlier. The one property that didn't fit the grid. No matching mailbox. No identical fence. No identical fence. No approval forms taped to my door. But over time, I started noticing things. Survey stakes appearing closer than they should have been. Maps posted online that didn't quite match what I knew to be true. And then one day, I saw it. A clean, printed neighborhood layout with my land outlined inside their boundary, like it had always belonged to them. That's when it stopped being background noise. That's when I realized this wasn't just development. This was encroachment. The first time I met her, she didn't knock. She stood at the edge of my driveway like she was inspecting something she already owned, clipboard tucked under one arm, phone in the other, slowly scanning my property with the kind of confidence you don't question, unless you know better. "Mr. Carter?" she called out, not loud, just precise. Practiced. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on a rag, and that's when I got a proper look at her. Perfect posture. Pressed blazer. Sunglasses even though the sun was barely out. Everything about her was controlled, deliberate, like she was playing a role she'd rehearsed 100 times. "I'm Linda Graves," she said, lowering the glasses just enough to make eye contact. "President of the HOA. She didn't offer a handshake. Didn't need to. People like her don't introduce themselves, they announce. "I wanted to personally welcome you into the community," she continued, flipping a page on her clipboard, "and also make you aware of a few compliance issues we've noted on your property." I didn't say anything at first, just watched. Because the tone didn't match the words. There was nothing welcoming about it. "Compliance issues?" I asked finally. She nodded, already tapping her pen against a printed sheet. "Yes. Unapproved fencing. Non-regulation land use. And what appears to be an unauthorized outbuilding near your east boundary." Her voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, but the details? They were off, not wildly. Just enough to bother me. "I'm not part of your HOA," I said, calm. She smiled. Not the kind of smile you give when you're wrong. The kind you give when you think the other person just doesn't understand yet. "That's a very common misconception," she replied, tilting her head slightly. "Your parcel falls within Phase 2 of the development, which places it under full HOA jurisdiction as of last quarter." The way she said it, clean, confident, official. It sounded legitimate. If you didn't know what to listen for. But I did. Because she wasn't citing anything real. No parcel number, no recorded amendment, no legal reference, just vague, polished language designed to sound like authority. And that's when the confusion hit. Not panic, not fear, just a quiet, growing question in the back of my mind. How exactly, I said slowly, does land that's been recorded and owned for over 60 years suddenly fall under something that didn't exist 5 years ago? For a split second, just a fraction, her expression tightened. Then it was gone, replaced with that same rehearsed calm. I'd be happy to provide documentation, she said smoothly. But for now, consider this an official notice. You'll need to bring your property into compliance. She turned before I could respond. Didn't wait, didn't explain. Just walked back to her car like the conversation was already over. And standing there, watching her leave, that's when the confusion turned into something else. Suspicion. Because nothing about that interaction felt legal. It felt staged. The first thing I did after she left was nothing. At least, that's what it looked like. No calls. No arguments. No emails fired off in frustration. I just went back inside, sat down at the table, and let the silence settle. Because when something feels off, you don't react. You observe. A day later, I got my first packet from the HOA, printed. Clean. Professionally bound like it came out of a corporate office, not a local development barely a year old. Inside were maps, compliance notes, and a highlighted section showing my property, boxed neatly inside their jurisdiction. At a glance, it looked convincing, but the longer I stared at it, the worse it got. The boundary lines didn't match, not just slightly off, structurally wrong. They'd straightened curves that weren't supposed to be straight, shifted corners that had been fixed for decades. Even the creek line something that physically couldn't move was drawn differently. That's not a mistake. That's a rewrite. I pulled out my grandfather's plats next. Old paper. Faded ink. Handwritten bearings that still held more accuracy than whatever I was looking at. Side by side, it wasn't even close. Their version looked new. Too new. No aging in the records. No historical layering. No sign it had evolved over time the way legitimate land documentation does. It was like someone had created it all at once, clean, polished, and completely disconnected from everything that came before it. That's when I stopped treating it like a misunderstanding and started treating it like a problem. I didn't confront them, didn't tip my hand. Instead, I went quiet, started pulling records from the county database, cross-checking filings, looking for anything that explained how they thought they could redraw boundaries that had been legally locked in for over half a century. Because one thing was clear now. They weren't guessing. They were building a version of reality, and I needed to find out why. Once I laid everything out, my records, their maps, the timelines, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't a small mistake, this was a slow push, because the notices didn't stop. A week after that first packet, another one showed up. Then another, each one more formal than the last. Fines started getting mentioned, small at first, almost laughable, but structured in a way that told me exactly where this was headed. Escalation, non-compliance penalties, daily charges, liens. That's how they do it. Not by taking your land outright, but by making it too expensive to keep. And if that doesn't work, they bury you in legal pressure until you either fold or they find a way to take control through the system. I'd seen that playbook before. Different context, same strategy. But this time, it was personal. Because this land wasn't just an asset sitting on paper. It was my grandfather's hands in the soil. His voice pointing out boundary lines that no one else even knew existed. It was every memory tied to a place that never changed until now. And, if they succeeded, that history doesn't just get challenged, it gets replaced. Rewritten into whatever version fits their development plan. Standing there, looking out across that land, I realized something that settled heavy in my chest. This wasn't just a dispute. This was erasure. The notices didn't come all at once. They came in waves. First, it was a single envelope thin, official-looking, stamped with the HOA's logo like that alone gave it authority. Inside was a courtesy notice, the kind designed to sound polite while quietly setting a trap. Unauthorized structure. No explanation. Just a grainy photo of my equipment shed, something that had been sitting on that exact spot longer than most of the houses in their development had even existed. I almost laughed. Until the second notice came. This one thicker, more formal, different tone, non-compliant fencing. Now they included measurements, regulations, a highlighted section from their bylaws about approved materials and height restrictions, rules I never agreed to, applied to land they had no jurisdiction over. And then came the third. That's when I stopped seeing it as coincidence. Improper land use. That one was bold. According to them, the way I maintained my own property clearing brush, storing equipment, even how parts of the land were left untouched violated their community standards. Community. The word sat wrong, because there was nothing communal about what they were doing. This wasn't about maintaining order. It was about forcing compliance. Each notice built on the last. Language shifting from friendly reminder to formal warning. Deadlines started appearing. Then consequences. And right there, buried in the fine print, fines. At first it was small. $50. Then $100. Numbers low enough to feel dismissible. Almost like they were testing whether I'd react. I didn't. So they escalated. 200. 500. Daily accrual clauses quietly added in. Legal phrasing tightened. References to enforcement procedures slipped into the margins. It was methodical. Calculated. Every letter designed to do one thing. Create pressure. Not enough to trigger immediate legal action, but just enough to make the situation feel like it was slipping out of control. And I knew exactly what they were counting on. Most people don't fight paperwork. They comply. They negotiate. They try to work things out before it gets worse. That's the system. Overwhelm them with process and they'll eventually give in. But the problem was, their entire case was built on something that didn't exist. And the more notices they sent, the clearer it became. They weren't just mistaken. They were committing to the lie. By the fourth notice, the total fines had crossed into the thousands. On paper, it looked like I was already losing. Non-compliant, uncooperative, in violation. A record building against me. One document at a time, but paper cuts both ways. Because while they were busy stacking penalties, I was stacking evidence. And sooner or later, those two things were going to collide. The paperwork was one thing. This was different. It started with the drive-bys. At first I didn't think much of it, just another car rolling past a little slower than usual. People checking out the one property that didn't fit the rest of the neighborhood. That kind of curiosity is normal, but curiosity doesn't repeat itself on a schedule. Every morning around the same time, same SUV. Dark tinted windows. Slow crawl past my fence. Pause just long enough to look like coincidence, then gone. Then it wasn't just mornings. Afternoons. Evenings. Different cars. Same behavior. And then the cameras came out. I caught the first one by accident. I was out near the east boundary clearing brush when I heard the faint click of a shutter. Not loud but distinct enough that you don't mistake it once you've heard it. I looked up and saw her. Not Linda this time. Someone else. HOA badge clipped to her shirt like it meant something out here. Phone held chest high, angled just enough to pretend she wasn't recording, while clearly recording. When she realized I'd seen her, she didn't apologize. Didn't even look embarrassed. Just lowered the phone and said, "Routine documentation." Routine. Like photographing someone else's property without permission was part of the job. I didn't respond. Just held eye contact until she turned and walked away. But it didn't stop there. More people started showing up. Not directly, never that obvious, but always nearby, standing a little too long at the edge of the road, slowing down when they passed. Conversations that quieted the moment I stepped outside, and then the comments started. Subtle. Casual. Always delivered like they weren't meant to be threats. You know they're serious about enforcement, right? Heard they've taken people to court over less. Wouldn't want things to get complicated for you. No names, no direct accusations. Just enough pressure to let me know the narrative was spreading. To them, I wasn't the guy who owned this land. I was the problem. The one refusing to cooperate. The one standing in the way of what they thought this place was supposed to be. And that's how intimidation works. Not loud, not obvious, just constant, a presence you can't ignore, a reminder that you're being watched. But here's what they didn't understand. I'd been in environments where being watched meant something real, where hesitation got you hurt. Compared to that, this wasn't fear. This was pattern recognition. And the pattern was clear. They weren't just documenting violations, they were building a case. The question was, for what? The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in, quietly. At first, it was just looks. The kind you catch out of the corner of your eye, neighbors pausing mid-conversation when you walk by, conversations dropping just enough in volume that you know your name was part of it. Then it turned into distance. People who used to wave didn't. Quick nods became nothing at all. Doors closed a little faster, conversations cut shorter. And eventually, the narrative surfaced. I heard it the first time at the edge of the road. Two homeowners talking just loud enough not to seem intentional. That's him. The one with the land issue? Yeah. HOA's been trying to deal with him for weeks. Apparently he's not even supposed to be there. Not supposed to be there. On land my family had owned for over 60 years. I kept walking. Didn't correct them. Didn't engage. Because by then I already understood what was happening. This wasn't random gossip. It was coordinated perception. The story spread fast, and it was always the same version. He's illegally occupying land. He refuses to follow community rules. He's ignoring official notices. Every piece of it crafted to do one thing: make me look like the problem. And the HOA? They never said it directly. They didn't have to. All it takes is a few concerned conversations, a couple of selectively shared documents, and suddenly the entire neighborhood believes they're watching someone who's in the wrong. That's how you isolate someone without ever confronting them. You turn the environment against them. And it worked. Not completely, but enough. I felt it. That subtle shift where you're no longer just living in a place, you're being tolerated in it. Watched, judged, pre-decided. And the more isolated I became, the clearer their strategy looked. Because once no one questions the narrative, you can do almost anything. At that point, it wasn't just about land anymore. It was about control. And they were getting closer to having it. At some point, the pressure stops feeling external. It settles in. Quiet. Not around you, but inside you. By then, the notices were stacking. The drive-bys hadn't stopped. And the way people looked at me, that had changed too. I started noticing it late at night. Sitting alone at the table, documents spread out in front of me, trying to connect pieces that didn't want to connect. And for the first time, I felt it. Not fear. Something heavier. Frustration. Because none of this made sense, and yet it was still happening. That's what gets to you. Not being wrong, but being pushed like you are. My phone buzzed one evening. Family. Checking in. Simple questions, everything okay? But there was something underneath it. Concern. The kind people don't say out loud because they don't want to make it worse. I told them I had it handled. And technically, I did. But after the call ended, I just sat there for a second longer than I should have. Because that question finally surfaced. What if they actually win? Not because they were right, but because they were relentless. Because they had structure, process, paper trails building against me one notice at a time. And most people, they don't fight systems like that. They fold. Not out of weakness, out of exhaustion. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, letting that thought sit just long enough to feel real. Then I looked back down at the table. Old records, original plats, county filings, truth sitting right in front of me. And that doubt, it didn't disappear, but it changed. Because pressure can distort a lot of things, but it doesn't rewrite facts. And I hadn't finished digging yet. That night, I stopped reacting and started verifying. Because here's something most people don't understand. HOAs don't create authority. They inherit it, and only if it's legally given to them. So I went straight to where authority actually lives. County records. Not summaries. Not HOA paperwork. The real filings. Deeds, parcel maps, Legal descriptions that don't change just because someone prints a newer version. And the first thing I confirmed, my land was never part of their HOA. Not in Phase 1, not in Phase 2, not in any amendment filed with the county, which means one thing. They had zero legal authority over it, and that matters more than anything they send you. Because in property law, there's a hierarchy, and at the top of it, the deed. Always the deed. Not HOA bylaws, not community guidelines, not whatever gets handed out in a welcome packet. If it's not in the recorded deed, it doesn't control the land. That's where most people get trapped. They see official-looking documents, legal language, signatures, and assume it all carries the same weight. It doesn't. Then I looked at their map again, the one they kept referencing. Clean lines, perfect angles, everything neatly boxed into their development layout. And that's when it clicked. That wasn't a legal boundary map. It was a projection, a developer's version of what the land should look like once everything is built, sold, and controlled. But projection isn't ownership, and planning isn't law. Real boundaries? They don't move because someone updated a design. They're fixed by surveys recorded, archived, and tied to physical markers placed in the ground. Markers I'd seen, markers my grandfather showed me how to find, markers that hadn't moved in over half a century. And then there was something else, a concept most people only hear about when it's too late: adverse possession. The idea that if someone uses land long enough under certain conditions, they can try to claim it. But that only works when ownership is unclear or uncontested. This wasn't either. My title was clean, my boundaries were documented, and my presence undeniable, which meant their entire approach, the pressure, the fines, the narrative, wasn't built on law. It was built on assumption, and the more I verified, the clearer it became. They weren't enforcing anything real. They were trying to make something unreal feel official. And that only works until someone checks the facts. The notice showed up early. Too early. I opened the door and saw it taped right at eye-level thick paper, bold lettering, the kind designed to stop you before you even start reading. Final notice, 48 hours to vacate. No build-up, no conversation, no warning. Just escalation. No warning. Just escalation. For a second, I didn't move. Not because I believed it, but because I recognized what it was. This wasn't enforcement. This was pressure at its peak. I pulled it off the door slowly, eyes scanning every line. Legal formatting, structured language, references to violations, fines, non-compliance. At a glance, it looked real. That's how they design it. But the longer I read, the more it fell apart. No case number, no court filing, no official county seal, and the language careful, vague, avoiding anything that could actually be challenged in a real legal setting. It wasn't an eviction order. It was a performance. A document meant to look powerful enough that no one would question it. Most people wouldn't. Most people would panic. Start packing. Make calls. Try to negotiate before it gets worse. That's what they were counting on. I stepped outside, notice still in my hand, and looked out across the property. Everything was the same. The land hadn't moved. The boundaries hadn't changed. The truth was still right where it had always been. But they were betting I wouldn't stand on it. That I'd fold before it got that far. And then I saw it. Fresh stakes. Bright orange markers pushed into the ground closer than they had any right to be. Not just wrong. Deliberately wrong. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. They were moving physically now, acting like the land was already theirs. I folded the notice once, slow and deliberate, and slipped it into my pocket. No calls, no reaction. Because this was exactly what I needed. Proof of intent. Proof of overreach. Proof that they were willing to act on something that didn't exist. And in that moment, everything lined up. The pressure, the narrative, the fake authority. It all led here. 48 hours. That's what they gave me. What they didn't know was, I didn't need that long. Because by the time they decided to act, I was already ready. And the next time I stepped outside, I wouldn't be responding. I'd be recording. By the time that notice showed up, I wasn't guessing anymore. I was verifying. Because once you strip away the pressure, the language, the performance, everything comes down to one place. Records. Not what people say. Not what they print. What's actually filed. So I went deeper. Not just surface-level searches, the kind anyone can pull up online in a few minutes. I went into the full chain of title, decades back, every transfer, every reference, every recorded change tied to that land, page by page. And the first thing that stood out, consistency. My parcel hadn't moved. Not once. Same legal description. Same boundary calls. Same survey references going back further than most of the houses around me had existed. No amendments. No subdivisions. No recorded inclusion into any HOA structure. Which meant one thing. Legally, my land had never been part of their system. Not by mistake. Not by oversight. By record. Then I pulled their filings. The development plans. The phases. The documents tied to when that HOA was formed and expanded. And that's where it got interesting. Because their boundaries were clearly defined. Filed. Approved. Recorded. But my parcel? It wasn't there. Not inside. Not partially included. Not even referenced. It sat right outside their mapped jurisdiction, clean, untouched, separate. Like a piece they couldn't legally claim, so they just started acting like they already had. And then I found it, buried in an older document, something most people wouldn't even think to check. An exclusion clause. Not highlighted. Not obvious. Just a single section in a recorded filing tied to the original development phase. It stated clearly that certain pre-existing parcels identified by their original legal descriptions were excluded from HOA governance and future phase expansion unless explicitly re-recorded with owner consent. Explicitly, meaning it couldn't be assumed, couldn't be implied, couldn't be forced. And my parcel matched that description exactly, which meant everything they'd done. The notices, the fines, the threats, the eviction attempt had no legal foundation. None. They hadn't just overstepped, they had bypassed the one thing that actually gives them authority. Consent, backed by record. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen for a second, letting it settle. Because this wasn't a weak point. This was a break. A clean, undeniable line between what they were claiming and what actually existed. And once you see that line, you can't unsee it. At that point, the situation wasn't unclear anymore. It was simple. They weren't enforcing rules. They were enforcing something that was never legally theirs to control. And now I had proof. Once I had it, everything changed. Not outside, inside. Because uncertainty, that was gone. What replaced it was clarity. And clarity doesn't rush. It prepares. I didn't make calls in panic, didn't fire off emails trying to prove anything. Instead, I got organized. Every document I'd pulled printed. Original deed. Full chain of title. County filings showing their HOA boundaries. And that clause, the one they either missed or hoped no one would ever find. I laid everything out on the table, one stack at a time, building something far more solid than anything they'd sent me. Proof, not arguments, not opinions. Proof. Then I backed it up. Digital copy saved, duplicated, stored in more than one place. Because when something matters, you don't rely on a single version of it. You make sure it can't disappear. After that, I made one call. Short, direct. County office. Not to complain, just to confirm. Parcel number. Boundary status. HOA inclusion. The answer came back exactly how I already knew it would. No, sir. That parcel is not within any recorded HOA jurisdiction. Clean. On record. I thanked them, hung up, and wrote down the name of the person I spoke to. Not because I needed validation, but because details matter. Then I stepped outside. Walked the property slowly, the way my grandfather used to. From one marker to the next, checking them, clearing them, making sure every point that defined that land was visible, undeniable, exactly where it was supposed to be. Because if this was going to happen, it was going to happen on the ground, where lines aren't theoretical. They're physical. By the time I was done, the sun was starting to drop. Everything was ready. Documents aligned. Facts confirmed. No gaps left. And for the first time since this started, it was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that comes from uncertainty. The kind that comes right before something breaks. Because now, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was waiting, and when they showed up, they weren't walking into confusion. They were walking into evidence. By the time they showed up, I was already outside. Not waiting at the door. Not reacting. Positioned. Right where the boundary line actually was. I saw them before they reached the gate. Same SUV. Same slow, controlled approach like they'd done this 100 times before. And then behind it, the tow truck. Hook already lowered. Engine idling like this was routine. Like they'd already decided how this was going to end. Linda stepped out first. Same blazer. Same sunglasses. Same calm, rehearsed confidence. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate. Just walked forward like she was stepping onto property she already owned. Behind her, 2 other HOA members followed. Phones out. Recording. Building their version of the story. I didn't say anything. Just watched. Because this time, I wanted everything on record. "You've overstayed," she said, stopping a few feet from me. Voice smooth. Controlled. Exactly like before. Final notice was delivered. "You failed to comply." I let the silence sit for a second, then reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Hit record. Held it steady. Her smile tightened. Just slightly. "Are you refusing to vacate?" she asked. Best when I stepped aside. Not back. To the side. Enough for her to see exactly where I was standing. Right next to a boundary marker. One she'd ignored. One that hadn't moved in over 60 years. "You should take a look at where you're standing," I said calm. She didn't. Didn't even glance down. Because confidence like that doesn't check itself. It assumes. "You're in violation." "No." I cut her off. First time. Clear. Controlled. 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 Not loud, but final. "You're trespassing." That landed. You could feel it. Not in her words. She didn't respond immediately, but in the shift. The slight pause. The recalculation. I didn't give it time to recover. I reached into the folder I had set on the table nearby and pulled out the documents. Held them up for her. For the camera. "For the record," I said, steady. "This is the original deed. Recorded. County verified." I flipped the page. Full chain of title. No breaks. No inclusion into any HOA jurisdiction. Another page. Filed development boundaries. Your HOA. Clearly defined. Then I held up the last one. Paused just long enough. "And this?" I tapped it once. "Is the clause you missed." Now she looked. Just for a second. Eyes flicking to the paper, reading. Processing. "This property," I continued, "was explicitly excluded from HOA governance unless re-recorded with owner consent." I lowered the document slightly. That never happened. Silence. Behind her, one of the HOA members shifted. Another lowered their phone just a bit, because now the script wasn't going the way they expected. "You don't have authority here," I said. Calm. Simple. Final. "And everything you've done, every notice, every fine, this," I gestured lightly toward the tow truck, "has no legal standing." Her posture changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The confidence wasn't gone. But it wasn't automatic anymore. "This is still under review," she said, trying to regain control. "We have documentation." "Then show it," I replied. No hesitation. No aggression. Just fact. Because I already checked the county records. Another pause. Longer this time. The kind that doesn't belong in a rehearsed interaction. Around us, a few neighbors had started to gather. Watching. Quiet. But present. And for the first time since this start, the narrative wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. I stepped forward slightly, closing the distance just enough to make one thing clear. "You don't get to redraw boundaries because it's convenient," I said. You don't get to claim land because it fits your layout. Then I looked directly at her. No movement, no hesitation. You're not enforcing rules. A beat. You're overstepping. And now, everyone could see it. The silence didn't last long. You could feel it shift, not from what was said, but from who was about to say something next. A vehicle pulled up behind the tow truck. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady. County markings on the side. The kind you don't ignore. The door opened, and a man stepped out calm, neutral, the kind of presence that doesn't need to prove authority. It already has it. He walked up without rushing, eyes scanning the scene once before settling on us. "What's going on here?" he asked, not directed at anyone in particular. Just a question placed into the air. Linda spoke first. Of course she did. "We're enforcing a legal eviction under HOA authority," she said, voice controlled, but tighter than before. "The homeowner has failed to comply with multiple notices." He raised a hand. Not rude, just enough to pause her. "Let me see the documentation." Simple. Direct. No emotion attached. She hesitated, just for a second before handing over her packet. Clean. Printed. The same version of reality they'd been pushing this entire time. He flipped through it, page by page. No reaction. No commentary. Then he looked at me. "You have anything?" he asked. I stepped forward, handing him my folder. Organized. Labeled. Every document exactly where it needed to be. He took it, opened it, and started reviewing. Slower this time. More deliberate, stopping at certain pages, going back, cross-checking. The kind of reading that doesn't look for confirmation. It looks for truth. And then it happened. That moment. Subtle but final. He closed the folder. Looked at Linda. Then back at the land. Then at the boundary marker right beside us. When he spoke, it wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. "This property," he said evenly, "is not under HOA jurisdiction." No emphasis. No dramatics, just fact. And that was enough. Everything shifted. Instantly. The tow truck driver straightened up. The phones lowered. Even the air felt different, because authority had just moved from assumption to record. He handed the documents back to me, then turned slightly toward Linda. "You'll need to remove anything placed beyond your recorded boundary," he added, "and I'd advise against any further enforcement action without proper verification." That wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. Clear, professional, final. Final. And just like that, the version of reality they'd been pushing collapsed. Right in front of everyone. The silence didn't last long. You could feel it shift not from what was said, but from who was about to say something next. A vehicle pulled up behind the tow truck. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady. County markings on the side. The kind you don't ignore. The door opened, and a man stepped out calm, neutral, the kind of presence that doesn't need to prove authority. It already has it. He walked up without rushing, eyes scanning the scene once before settling on us. "What's going on here?" he asked, not directed at anyone in particular. Just a question placed into the air. Linda spoke first. Of course she did. "We're enforcing a legal eviction under HOA authority," she said, voice controlled, but tighter than before. "The homeowner has failed to comply with multiple notices." He raised a hand. Not rude, just enough to pause her. "Let me see the documentation." Simple. Direct. No emotion attached. She hesitated, just for a second before handing over her packet. Clean. Printed. The same version of reality they'd been pushing this entire time. He flipped through it, page by page. No reaction. No commentary. Then he looked at me. "You have anything?" he asked. I stepped forward, handing him my folder. Organized. Labeled. Every document exactly where it needed to be. He took it, opened it, and started reviewing. Slower this time. More deliberate, stopping at certain pages, going back, cross-checking. The kind of reading that doesn't look for confirmation. It looks for truth. And then it happened. That moment. Subtle but final. He closed the folder. Looked at Linda. Then back at the land. then at the boundary marker right beside us. When he spoke, it wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. This property, he said evenly, is not under HOA jurisdiction. No emphasis. No dramatics, just fact. And that was enough. Everything shifted. Instantly. The tow truck driver straightened up. The phones lowered. Even the air felt different, because authority had just moved from assumption to record. He handed the documents back to me, then turned slightly toward Linda. You'll need to remove anything placed beyond your recorded boundary, he added, and I'd advise against any further enforcement action without proper verification. That wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. Clear, professional, final. Final. And just like that, the version of reality they'd been pushing collapsed. Right in front of everyone. For a second, no one moved. Not her. Not the people behind her. Not even the ones watching from the edge of the road. Because when something like that gets said, clearly, officially, without hesitation, there's nothing to argue with. But she tried anyway. That's not, she started, voice tighter now, the smooth edge gone. That's not consistent with the documentation we have on file. It sounded weaker the moment it left her mouth. Because now, everyone knew which documentation actually mattered. The county official didn't respond. Didn't need to. He'd already said enough. And that's when it hit her. Not all at once. In pieces. You could see it in the way her posture shifted, the way her eyes moved, not confident anymore, but searching. Looking for something to hold on to. There wasn't anything. Behind her, one of the HOA members lowered their phone completely. Another stepped back, just slightly but enough to break formation. Because the story had changed. And they knew it. You said this was verified, someone from the crowd muttered. Not loud, but loud enough. Another voice followed. So he was never part of it. Now it wasn't just happening in front of them, it was happening around them. Publicly. And that's the moment control slips. Not when you're proven wrong, but when everyone else sees it. She tried to recover. Adjusted her stance. Straightened her shoulders. But it didn't land the same. Because confidence only works when it's backed by something real. And now, it wasn't. Every notice she'd sent, every fine she'd issued, every claim she'd made was unraveling in real time. Right there. In front of neighbors she'd convinced. In front of people who trusted her authority until they saw what it was built on. Nothing. She didn't say anything else after that. Couldn't. Because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. So she turned. Slow. Controlled, trying to hold on to something that was already gone. And walked back toward her car. Not leading anymore. Just leaving. And just like that, the person who acted like she owned everything couldn't even defend one claim. It didn't change overnight, not completely. But you could feel it. That shift, the same roads, the same houses, the same people. But something in the air was different. At first it was small, a nod. Someone who used to look away, didn't. Another slowed down not to watch, but to acknowledge. Nothing dramatic. Just different. Because once the truth comes out, people start adjusting. Quietly. Carefully. Like they're trying to figure out where they stood before everything changed. A few days later, one of the neighbors stopped near the edge of my property. Didn't come all the way in. Just stood there for a second. I didn't know, he said. Simple. No long explanation. No defense. Just that. I nodded. Because there wasn't anything else to say. And that's how it started. Not with apologies, with awareness. More people began asking questions. Not confrontational, curious. What actually happened? Were they really not allowed to do that? How long has your land been separate, and for the first time since this began? I wasn't explaining myself to defend something. I was explaining it because people wanted to understand. That's a different kind of conversation, because now the pressure wasn't on me. It had shifted. The HOA meetings got quieter, less confident, less absolute. The same people who used to speak like everything was already decided started choosing their words more carefully. Because once authority gets challenged publicly, it doesn't recover the same way. Not immediately, and not completely. People start thinking for themselves again, checking things, verifying. The kind of behavior that doesn't exist when everyone just assumes the system is right, and that's what changed the most. Not opinions, awareness. I could see it in the way people moved around the neighborhood. Less certain, more observant. Because once you realize something was wrong, you start wondering what else might be. As for me, I didn't say much. Didn't need to. I was still on the same land, same boundaries, same markers in the ground that had always been there. Nothing had changed on my side. But how people saw it, that changed. The looks were different now. Not suspicious, not distant, measured, respectful, not because I proved something to them, but because they saw it for themselves. And respect that comes from observation, it sticks. No announcements, no statements, just a quiet correction. The same place that once felt like it was turning against me, settled, balanced again. Because when control fades, reality comes back into focus. And this time, everyone was looking at the same version of it. It didn't change overnight, not completely. But you could feel it. That shift. The same roads, the same houses, the same people. But something in the air was different. At first it was small, a nod. Someone who used to look away didn't. Another slowed down not to watch, but to acknowledge. Nothing dramatic, just different. Because once the truth comes out, people start adjusting. Quietly, carefully, like they're trying to figure out where they stood before everything changed. A few days later, one of the neighbors stopped near the edge of my property. Didn't come all the way in. Just stood there for a second. I didn't know, he said. Simple. No long explanation. No defense. Just that. I nodded, because there wasn't anything else to say. And that's how it started. Not with apologies, with awareness. More people began asking questions. Not confrontational, curious. What actually happened? Were they really not allowed to do that? How long has your land been separate, and for the first time since this began? I wasn't explaining myself to defend something. I was explaining it because people wanted to understand. That's a different kind of conversation, because now the pressure wasn't on me. It had shifted. The HOA meetings got quieter, less confident, less absolute. The same people who used to speak like everything was already decided started choosing their words more carefully. Because once authority gets challenged publicly, it doesn't recover the same way. Not immediately, and not completely. People start thinking for themselves again, checking things, verifying. The kind of behavior that doesn't exist when everyone just assumes the system is right, and that's what changed the most. Not opinions, awareness. I could see it in the way people moved around the neighborhood. Less certain, more observant. Because once you realize something was wrong, you start wondering what else might be. As for me, I didn't say much. Didn't need to. I was still on the same land, same boundaries, same markers in the ground that had always been there. Nothing had changed on my side. But how people saw it, that changed. The looks were different now. Not suspicious, not distant, measured, respectful, not because I proved something to them, but because they saw it for themselves. And respect that comes from observation, it sticks. No announcements, no statements, just a quiet correction. The same place that once felt like it was turning against me, settled, balanced again. Because when control fades, reality comes back into focus. And this time, everyone was looking at the same version of it. After everything settled, I didn't go anywhere, didn't celebrate, didn't call anyone. I just walked, out across the land, same path I'd taken 100 times before, but it felt different now. Quieter. Not because the world had changed, but because the noise was gone. The kind of noise you don't realize is there until it disappears. The wind moved slow across the field, brushing through the grass the same way it always had. Steady, familiar. I could hear it clearly now. No engines, no distant voices, no tension sitting in the air. Just space. I stepped off the worn path and let my boots press into the soil, soft in some places, firm in others, real, untouched. Exactly the way it had always been. That's the thing about land, it doesn't argue. It doesn't react. It just stays. And as long as you understand it, it stays honest. I walked toward the east boundary. The same line they tried to move. The same place those bright orange stakes had been pushed in like they meant something. Most of them were gone now. Pulled out. Renewed. Like they'd never been there. But the original marker, that was still in place. Half buried. Weathered. Solid. I stopped beside it and looked down for a moment, then bent slightly, brushing away the loose dirt around it with my hand. The metal caught the light just enough to stand out. Simple. Unimpressive. But permanent. And suddenly, I could hear his voice. Clear as if he was standing right there. This right here? He'd tap it with his boot. This is what keeps everything honest. I didn't understand it back then. Not fully. But standing there now, I did. Because it wasn't just about a piece of metal in the ground, it was about what it represented. A line that couldn't be moved just because someone decided it should be. A record that didn't change under pressure. A truth that stays where it was put. I reached into the back of my truck and grabbed a small post I'd brought out earlier. Nothing fancy, just solid. Measured. Correct. I set it beside the original marker, adjusted it carefully, lined it up exactly where it needed to be, then pressed it into the ground. Firm. Deliberate. Not to claim anything new, but to make something old. Visible again. I stepped back and looked at it. 2 points now. One buried in history. One standing in the present. Both saying the same thing. This line doesn't move. The wind picked up slightly, moving across the field again, carrying that same quiet with it. And for the first time since all of this started, there was nothing left to prove. No documents to check. No arguments to prepare. No one to convince. Just the land. The way it had always been. I stood there for a few seconds longer, letting it settle. Then turned and walked back. Not because I was done, but because everything that needed to be said already had been. In the end, this was never just about land. It was about knowing what is truly yours and not letting anyone take it through pressure, confusion, or fear. A lot of people believe HOAs have unlimited power. They don't. Their authority only exists where it's legally recorded, and if the paperwork isn't there, neither is their control. That's the part most people miss. Because intimidation is loud. It shows up with notices, fines, deadlines, and legal language designed to make you react before you think. But paperwork? It's quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't rush. It just sits there, waiting to be checked. And when you do, everything becomes clear. The situation could have gone very differently. If I had reacted instead of verifying, if I had trusted their documents instead of checking my own, I would have lost something that was never theirs to take. But facts don't change under pressure. Records don't rewrite themselves. And truth doesn't depend on who speaks louder. They tried to erase my land. Instead, they exposed themselves.